Since we're talking about school, let's start with a quiz. I'm going to give you a 2-question quiz. Take out a piece of paper and a pen, and I'll give you question 1. In 2 words or fewer, what do you most want in life? Okay, that's question 1. Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer. Question 2. In 2 words or fewer, what do schools teach? Now, since I'm not here in person, I can't call on you to read out your answers, but I've done this dozens of times with hundreds of teachers and thousands of students, and I can tell you basically what you wrote. Under what you most want in life, you wrote happiness, love, fulfillment, success, harmony, meaning, purpose. Under what do schools teach, you wrote down discipline, literacy, numeracy, conformity, how to get a job. And what's remarkable about this 2 questions is there's no overlap between the 2. Schools do not teach what we most want in life. And I'm going to talk about why that's so and how we can change that and what the consequences of that are for the future of education. There is something new under the sun now. Part of the reason we didn't want to teach happiness, well-being, fulfillment, meaning, is that there was no technology documented that could actually do that. And indeed, in the world of psychology, Freud and Schopenhauer told us that the best you could ever do in life was not to be miserable. So the job of psychology, psychiatry, was to hold our suffering to as near zero as possible. Now, the theme of what I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes is that indeed we can build well-being. We can do it in school, and that the Freudian notion that a good life is just about minimal misery is empirically false, morally insidious, and a dead end for education and for a nation. So I want you to imagine something I'll call positive education. In positive education, we both continue to teach the traditional goals of education, the second list, for the most part, the skills that lead people to success in the workplace. But in addition, we can teach life satisfaction and happiness. So I'm going to contend that we now know something about raising happiness in schools for children and adolescents. Now, indeed, if I had said this 30 years ago to you, you really should not have listened. And that is that because of the dogmas of psychology, all of our measures, everything we knew, was about the negative side of life. There was no theory of well-being and happiness. All of our measures were about misery, depression, anxiety. We didn't have measures of well-being. All of our interventions were about both pharmacological and, most importantly, educational and psychological, were about relieving misery. And now things have changed, and that's what I've been up to for the last 30 years or so. So first, let me tell you what my theory of well-being is, and this will be relevant to us as teachers. I am, by the way, a teacher. That's my primary duty. And But this theory is about what we can raise in our young people in addition to knowledge, literacy, numeracy, and the like. The theory says there are 5 different elements that free people, children, adolescents, who are not suffering pursue. And the acronym in English is PERMA, PERMA. The first one is positive emotion, feeling good, subjective well-being, being happy. But there's more, this is more than just cheerfulness and smiling, because the second element of positive education and positive psychology is engagement, being when time stops for you, being one with the music. The third element that's teachable is relationships, better relationships. The fourth element, and very important for school and the workplace, is meaning, purpose, and mattering. And the fifth element is the traditional element of school, accomplishment. So that's my working theory of what it is we can be raising in school in addition to raising knowledge. Now, the second thing that's new in positive psychology and positive education are we have interventions that work. We have interventions that reliably raise well-being. And I'll show you some data in a couple of minutes on this. It's well tested, but I come from the kind of psychology in which we're very careful about measuring outcomes against random assignment, placebo-controlled situations. And I spent a good part of my life measuring psychotherapy and medications against placebo controls. So when positive psychology and positive education began, we started to look at interventions against random assignment, placebo controlled, that were designed to raise well-being. I'll tell you a couple of interventions in a minute, but the reason these interventions are important is we now know a great deal about the consequences of happiness. Now, you're all familiar with the causes of happiness, so you probably think being healthy, having good relationships, being successful produces high well-being. But what we've worked on for the last 25 years is the opposite. What are the consequences of having high well-being? The reason this is important is I'm going to suggest to you we should be teaching well-being. And that's because it turns out high well-being is causal. So there are now hundreds of studies in what you do with children, with adults at time one is to do something like measure their talents, their IQ, their grades at time one, and you also measure their well-being at time one. And then you look into the future and you ask the question, what are the consequences of having well-being over and above the initial talents, the initial grades? And the answer is that well-being has very large effects. It's not just caused by success, it causes success. So in the area of accomplishment in school, children who have high well-being learn more. They get higher national standardized examinations. They do better on grade point average than their talents predict. Secondly, we look at athletes and we find in the major baseball leagues, the National Basketball Association, that athletes who have high well-being go on to do better, particularly when things are difficult. And we also find physical health is better, and very important for you as teachers, optimistic and people with high well-being live on average 6 to 8 years longer than pessimistic people with low well-being, and that's holding constant all the usual risk factors. So that's a very brief argument that the consequences of teaching well-being, if we could do it, are better accomplishment in school, uh, better performance in the workplace, better performance on the playing field, and better health and longevity. Now, let me talk about interventions, what can be done in the classroom, what you can teach your students about well-being. And I'm going to try to share my screen now to do this. I'm going to talk about positive education and their data on the efficacy of the interventions. So the first thing I want you to look at is this picture, the swan. And the reason I'm going to do that, I just have time to talk about one intervention that can be taught in the classroom that's very well validated. I'll have to use a homey example from my own life about this. So my wife is an amateur black and white photographer. And about 3 years ago, she came downstairs and said, Marty, I just got a call from the editor of Black and White magazine, and I won. I beat all these professional photographers for the best black and white photograph. Now, the question is, when your spouse or a child or your best friend comes to you with a victory, what do you say? And by the way, I should tell you that this intervention comes out of marital therapy. I taught marital therapy for a while. There you teach people how to fight better. You're trying to change insufferable marriages into barely tolerable marriages. And instead of doing that, positive marital therapist asks, how do you celebrate together? What do you say when someone you love comes to you with a victory? Well, there's a 2x2 table of what you can say. So Mandy came to me with this astonishing news, and what I would have said, and what you, for the most part, would say, until I read the literature, was passive constructive, which is, congratulations, dear, you deserve it. That has no effect on a relationship. I've trained 40,000 drill sergeants in the United States Army on this technique, and what they do for the most part is passive destructive. So they would have said something like, you know what tax bracket that's going to put us into? And that's a relationship destroyer. Sorry, that's active destructive. Passive destructive is what's for dinner. The only thing that works is active constructive, and you can teach this. In active constructive, you begin with an authentic appreciation of what's said. In that case, I said, Mandy, was it the swan, the black and white swan that won the prize? And she said, yeah. And now you try to put the person in touch with the strengths that brought about this victory. So I said to Mandy to relive it, where were you when the editor called? And she told me. I said, now, what did he say exactly verbatim? And she told me. And what strengths do you think you have in your photography that won you this prize? And she said, well, I'm good with gray. I'm good with nuances. And then I said, well, how can you teach our kids? I have 7 children, by the way, two grandsons just born in the last 2 weeks, our first grandsons. And how can you teach the kids about photography and art using that strength? And finally, let's go open that bottle of champagne in the refrigerator. Now, there are about a dozen techniques or so that you can teach. And I'm an empirical scientist, and I wouldn't be presenting the notion that in the classroom we can teach higher well-being but for the large amount of data that these things work. So there are 340, this is a meta-analysis of 347 studies with 72,000 people, varying in age. And what they show is that these interventions increase well-being, they increase strengths, they increase quality of life, they decrease depression, they decrease anxiety, they decrease stress. Then these are the data set about programs as a whole. That was the data set about each of the individual interventions to raise well-being. And there are 33 controlled trials with about 24,000 participants. And these are aimed at producing resilience, mostly in the classroom, using cognitive behavioral interventions of the sort that I just mentioned preventatively. And what you show is significant effect sizes for children, for adolescents, with or without homework, and very importantly, led by teachers. So there's good teacher training for this, and these effects exist 6 months later. And finally, in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, there are 49 studies with about 6,000 children and adolescents. And again, you find these programs are relative to controls, decreased depression, they decreased conduct disorders, they decrease anxiety, they decrease distress, and they raise well-being. I don't have time to talk about how you can find out in detail about all of this, but here's the email and the website of the International Positive Education Network. So for those of you who want this in detail, that's the relevant material. Okay. So I want to conclude with a few remarks about COVID and what we've learned about young people in COVID over the last year and a half. So we've been asking the question, who has been most damaged by COVID? And very interestingly, when we first started to look at this, we found increases in mental illness, increases in anxiety and depressive disorders. But as time went on, those increases became small and the effect was bigger on something else. Well, first we found that it's young people who are in the age of expanding, finding work, finding what they're good at, find the beginning of romantic relationships that were most vulnerable to COVID. And what we found, and here's the better way of thinking about what COVID has cost. For me, at the bottom is mental illness itself. And at the top is high PERMA, high well-being. But in the middle is languishing. And languishing is defined by not having mental illness, but having low PERMA. And so what we found during COVID is that the big effect is that quite a few young people have moved from high well-being, high PERMA, down to languishing. And that points directly to what we need to do as educators, as parents, and that is raise the PERMA to bring our young people out of languishing. So let me conclude what I've said today. I've said there is something new under the sun. 30 years ago, there was no technology about teaching well-being. All we knew about was the relief of misery. But what's happened in the last 30 years due to positive psychology and positive education is we can measure well-being, we have a theory of well-being, we have reliable interventions that can be done by parents and teachers, and particularly teachers in the classroom, that raise well-being, that bring children higher PERMA. And if you take those things together, that means that well-being can be taught in school. Secondly, well-being should be taught in school. And there are two reasons it should be taught. One, if all you cared about was achievement in school, there's very good data that high well-being increases achievement in school. But very importantly for me, our children being happy, well-being, more positive emotion, more engagement, better relationships, more meaning in life is valuable in its own right, even if it had no effect on achievement. But it does affect achievement. And so for me, much of the future of education, of parenting, of the workplace, is measuring and raising PERMA in the classroom. And the final thing I want to say is this is a meeting about digitalization and artificial intelligence. And I'm often asked, is this going to make kids smarter? Is it going to increase their knowledge? And the answer is, I really don't know. It really has not been tested. And the data that's around is quite conflicting about it. One thing I've learned about digitalization, it gives my students an opportunity to do something else while I'm teaching, and that is to look at their email. So I don't know about the future of digitalization, but you can make your students happier. You can make your students happier, and that will increase the traditional goals of education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Selgman. I hope you hear the applause. So we're now open for, let's say, 2 or 3 questions from our audience, which is quite, I would say, un-Slovenian. Slovenians really like to ask questions during coffee breaks and lunch breaks. But let us try if you really encouraged a lot of people here to ask questions. So do I see a raising hand for a question? Yes, I do. And you get your microphone from the back. So, our first question, Dr. Selgman.
Okay, I will try to formulate it correctly. So in raising well-being children, how does this cope with the society that is not, that is competitive, egoistic, and if we raised children that have well-being, does that also transform society?
A very important question indeed. And as a psychologist, most of my goals are about changing not just children, but changing society as a whole. And when we live in a society that's pessimistic, that believes that there's been no human progress and that we can't overcome the challenges we have about the environment, about race and the like, this is communicated to our children. But empirically, this kind of pessimism is self-fulfilling. So when people deny human progress and communicate that to our children and tell us that everything is a mess, that's self-fulfilling. I spent a lot of my life working on helplessness and pessimism. And indeed, when a society believes those things, it is self-fulfilling. So part of our goal is not just raising the optimism and well-being of young people, but of changing the nature of society itself. Now, you mentioned competition. I'm not at all against competition. I like the traditional goals of education, and competition is one of our tools. But one can both have competition and have high PERMA as well. So in competition in teams, what you find is high PERMA within teams and competition as well. But you're probably also pointing to social comparison, in which you're competing singly against others and you're comparing yourselves to others. Well, social comparison forms of competition indeed hurt well-being. But just to sum up, even in the face of the bad events that we hear about every day, well-being is learnable. Optimism is learnable, and when it's realistic, it produces higher achievement in addition to more well-being.
Okay, thank you very much for the first answer. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes?
I understand you said that it's crucial to teach our children how to be happy. So in a way, the most important factors, of course, are teachers. Should we teach our teachers to be happy and how to empower them in order to achieve this goal you've set?
And the answer is absolutely yes. So the method of raising well-being of children is a teach the teachers method. So let me just tell you what we did with the United States Army in the teaching of positive psychology, resilience, and well-being. We trained the teachers in the Army, 40,000 of them, the drill sergeants, in the techniques of raising well-being. And the teachers themselves, in this case, the drill sergeants, then taught the 1.1 million soldiers the skills of well-being. When we go into schools, we don't teach teachers directly using manuals. We don't teach the students well-being directly. We teach the teachers first to learn well-being in their own lives, to learn techniques such as the one I talked about with the swan, and then how to teach them to children. So the methodology here is the teaching of teachers about the techniques of well-being, and then the teachers go on to teach the students, and I showed you the documentation that it works, that it raises well-being, it decreases depression, and increases achievement.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Selgman. One more question, because all good things are three. Yes, we see a lady there. Yes, that would be our last question for you, Dr. Selgman.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have been wondering, since I think that the gap between of the values of formal education and digital entertainment, for instance, this topic related to Squid Game for being the most popular Netflix series ever. And I think that there's a huge gap between our values and values representing this entertainment world being really violent. What should be done for that? Or should we somehow respond as educators to this phenomenon?
Yes, very important. In addition to the gaming programmers, there's a whole organization called Games for Health. And these are gamers who produce games and entertainment that are around the building of well-being. So it's my hope we can use the technology, and there are instances of it. There's an organization called Happify, which uses the technology to increase PERMA. So there are indeed games for health that can be used to raise PERMA. So one of my hopes about digitalization, it will become not just a tool for violence and mindless entertainment, but a tool for raising engagement, meaning, purpose in life.